Hi, I'm Greg Farrar. It's June 23rd, and this is my COVID-19 Trends livecast. We're going to cover the trends at the countries level, the states of the United States, and the counties of California. So let's go. I'm going to try to fire up I'm going to try to watch the chat. So if you drop something here in YouTube chat, hopefully I'll see it. I try to keep that window visible over to the side of my screen, but I tend to focus on the big window here that you can see. So sometimes I'm not great at watching the chat, but drop some there and I'll probably see it. Starting with the countries. The United States, as always, the leader in total cases, followed by Brazil, Russia, and now India. Worth noting that there's a difference between these three and India, really, which is that their population is much smaller, and so India actually doesn't typically show up in my analysis very much because I focus on population adjusted numbers. India's numbers look kind of big here, but they are not big compared to its population. Whereas the United States and Brazil especially are pretty big compared to their population. So let's go straight there. Looking by population, we see that some of the smaller countries rise to the top here. Countries that have it much worse than the United States adjusted by population, but don't have nearly as many cases total. Qatar, which was the big news a month ago, at least in my news, has shrunk down to a mere 400 daily cases per million. That's still a very high number, but much lower than when it was at its peak in the 600s. Bahrain, its neighbor, similarly at 400 some daily cases per million. Let me just do something real quick, make sure I can hear myself. All right, well, my equalizer thing is running, so I'm assuming that someone would tell me if they couldn't hear me. All right, Chile. The talk in Central South America tends to be around Brazil, but really it's Chile that's the problem. Adjusted for population, Chile has it worse than anyone else in Central South America, or really anyone else in the world. If we look at look briefly down here, we can see that Qatar and Bahrain are dropping, and in fact have turned the corner and are shrinking. This is the growth chart, the rope chart I sometimes call it, because it looks a little bit like a rope when I've got all of them running simultaneously. But here with these two strands, we can see that Qatar and Bahrain have turned the corner and are actually dropping. Whereas, well, Chile actually, I was going to say Chile is still rising, but really Chile is also showing that it has turned the corner and is dropping, though just barely. It's just turned that corner today or yesterday. So Bahrain is leveling off and will drop soon on this graph. Chile as well seems to be peaking around today. So the worst countries in the world are getting better. Let's look a little further down. There are still a few hot spots. I'm going to chop those ones out of the picture so we can see better. We've got Oman, Panama, and Armenia. What are those looking like in the total growth chart, the daily growth chart? Well, these are all looking pretty good as well, especially Oman, Armenia are just over it as of a few days ago. They've peaked, they're heading downward. They've been heading downward in growth rate for a long time, so pretty good chance that these two will recover, and that these two have turned the corner towards recovery. Not so much with Panama. Panama at least is seeing its growth rate drop, but it certainly hasn't hit zero. Well, today I guess it hit zero, but I think this trend will probably continue downward for a while before the trend line hits zero. But Panama also heading in the right direction. It's seeing a significant daily growth at 2.5%, but its growth rate is dropping. So now finally down below those ones, somewhere here we'll find Brazil. Where is Brazil on this chart? Brazil. So Brazil was all the news a little bit ago, but it's leveled off even in this chart. Brazil is steady at 124 daily cases per million. That's warm, technically, according to my nomenclature. That's warm, but only barely. 100 is the cutoff to be warm. In Brazil, if we look here, well, again, there's a little bit of news here for me. I expected to see Brazil down well below zero because its trend line did cross zero a few days ago, but it's had one bad day and two neutral days, so it still looks like it's fighting to cross that zero line. Brazil seems to be peaking. It is at zero growth in the trend line, but with a few days not so good, maybe it's going to turn around and head back above zero. We will watch Brazil. But in any case, just to compare it with, say, Chile, there's not really much of a comparison. Chile has 340 daily cases per million versus only 124 for Brazil. So Chile is hot. Brazil is barely warm. So Chile is really the news here, and then we have Panama also looking a lot worse than Brazil in daily cases per million. Peru was worse than Brazil, but is recovering. All right, I'm going to move on. There's a lot to talk about in the states today, the states of the United States, so I'm not going to spend as much time in the countries, and I'll just say the countries are looking pretty good. If we just start looking at the trends, Chile, though they may have a lot of cases, the question is, are they headed in a good or a bad direction from this place where they have a fair number of cases? Well, Qatar is doing great, Bahrain is doing well, Chile is doing okay, it's crossing zero, Oman doing well, it's shrinking, Panama is not shrinking but is headed in the right direction, Armenia is shrinking, Brazil is right around the corner, at the corner towards shrinking. Kuwait is maybe rising a little bit in its growth trend, but it's below zero, so it is shrinking. It's just not totally clear if it's going to stay in that good place. Saudi Arabia has a growth rate that's substantial, but is flat and maybe even slightly downward. Peru is looking great. Sweden looking good, shrinking and accelerating downward. Moldova, a lot like, was it Saudi Arabia? A lot like Saudi Arabia, 3 or 4% growth, but flat and maybe even turning slightly downward. Those are probably the worst two right now in the top, Saudi Arabia and Moldova, but these are not bad graphs. A bad graph is Arizona, as we'll see. A bad graph is 8% growth and rapidly accelerating. We see nothing like that among the countries of the world. And it takes till the United States before we see a graph that really fits my definition of bad in any sense for growth. The United States growing at 3.6% daily, that's very substantial as a growth rate, but more problematically it is accelerating. So the United States, we have to get way down this list before we see any states or any countries that are really looking problematic among the hottest ones. And the United States, I would say, is the worst. Bolivia not looking great either. Let's see, anyone else here that really stands out as a problem spot? And so this is why, well, okay, Honduras looks terrible right now. 10% growth rate and accelerating, way worse than the rest. A few others, Bolivia maybe, Dominican Republic not looking great, but as we go through the whole list, there's just not that much bad news at the country level. Countries are looking pretty good, but not so much. There are a couple of them, Dominican, Republic and Bolivia. Honduras is really in quite bad shape, but by far the biggest country that's not looking great is the United States. It is the worst, and so that's why I want to spend more time in the United States, because as it happens, I have a lot of reports about the United States. Here's the overall picture of the countries. Very messy, not going to try to figure out which line is which here, but it gives me sort of the sense that that maybe more countries are shrinking than rising. We have these few odd ones way up in the 40% range, Namibia and other strange outliers, and those may become, next month's Qatar, someone who's way up above the norm in total cases per million, but none of those are in that list yet. None of those appear in the list of high total cases per million. There are very few countries in the world right now that actually are even warm. But the United States is one of them, I believe. Let's just make sure. The United States has always been kind of on the edge of being warm, never quite gotten warm, but I think it might just be there. Where is it? Okay, these are daily cases per million. There's the United States. Not really, actually. So from one perspective, the United States is still doing okay. It's not yet warm. It's still in the 80s something, which need be 100 to be a daily cases warm spot. But it has had a few recently, and it's trended in that direction. So the growth of the United States is quite bad right now, but in total cases, it's doing fine. Daily cases per million for the worst spots we've ever seen have been the high hundreds, even in the thousands or low thousands. The United States is nowhere near that, so it has a whole lot of runway here before I would say it's in all ways a problem. But given that, the trajectory it's on is not good. So let's move on to the states, because that is really the news, I think, for the world right now is the United States. Europe is fine. Even Sweden seems to be getting over it. Asia had it, got over it. The Central South America cluster is dying away. But here in the United States, things are not looking quite so good. Looking at the states from this very high-level view of total cases, I always say I don't spend any time on total cases, but I always lately seem to be spending some time here, so I'll just stop saying I don't spend time on total cases. But I will say that I prefer adjusted by population, and I prefer daily numbers. And the nice thing about this graph is when things are really out of whack, it jumps right out of you as dots that don't match their trend line. So New York is well below its trend line, which is out of whack in a good way. It means that it's pushing very strongly towards recovery. On the other hand, California has pushed above its trend line and is now has the most daily cases other than or most total cases other than New York. California is huge, so that doesn't inherently mean anything, but the fact that it's pushing above its trend line is problematic. Illinois seems to be doing fine with its dots well below the trend line, but then we've got Florida and Texas, I think that's Texas, yeah, Florida and Texas above their trend lines showing strong growth. Texas does not yet have that many total cases. If we switch down to the adjusted by population, I should say, if we switch down to the population adjusted graph, one of my favorites, let's just take a quick look at Texas, because we're not going to talk much about Texas. At least not yet, though looking from this graph, I think Texas might be in my news a lot more coming up. I've kind of ignored Texas because it's not even warm. Here's the 100 line. Texas trend line is below 100. But if you look at these recent days, Texas has had 4 days in a row. 5 days in a row, because there's one really crazy one at actually it's not too high, but at 250 it's actually had a hot spot day. And now since then it's had 4 warm spot days. The trend line hasn't quite noticed this, and there are these ones that seem to be very low, these points, but surely looking at this you would say Texas seems to be heading upwards. Always takes the trend line a while to catch on, but Texas probably is a warm spot, even if its trend line won't admit it. Texas is a warm spot because it's had five days in a row, or maybe this one kind of is a, I don't know, these two together might really be 2 days that average more at 150, but still 150 daily cases per million, that's a warm spot. It's not 1,500 like New York had, which was the worst we've seen, I think, in a state. So it's still a tenth of New York, still not quite newsworthy, but it's Texas, it's big. If it starts to heat up, we're gonna see some fireworks. Similarly, California has not really made my news because it's not warm, still not warm, not even as bad as Texas actually, if you look at the recent numbers, but it really is pushing that 100. It's rising and it's pushing that 100 mark, at which point I'd say it's a daily cases warm spot. But California not quite worthy of national news yet. The ones that are worthy of national news are the Gang of Six here. I'm gonna focus in on just the top. So here's that 100 line. A couple states worth noting that Iowa tried to be warm and kind of got there, but is now dropping away. So Iowa is no longer a warm spot. California, as we saw, is headed towards there, but not quite there. But the ones that really are warm spots, and in one case hot spot, are Utah. These will be familiar for those who've been watching me or the news. Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Arkansas, and way up here, Arizona. So the AAA, Arizona, Arkansas, and Alabama, North and South Carolina, and Utah are the Gang of Six states that just can't seem to get over this thing yet. They're rising sharply. You can see it here. We'll see on the rope chart whether that's really true, because this, again, these lines tend to keep going for quite a while, even after there's evidence that they should be bending. But the rope chart tells us very quickly when something is headed up or down. But regardless, these are all warm spots, and Arizona is a hot spot. Nothing else is, just those six. We do see, when we look down lower at the some of the other states, we see there are some other warm spots that are not, at least they're growth hot spots, but they are not yet in the category of a daily cases warm spot, much less a daily cases hot spot. So they're up and coming. Maybe they'll get there, but they're not there yet. And California actually is one of those now. So looking at the yeah, these are just the hottest in daily cases per million. These are the hottest states. So first of all, let's just step back and say some are rising, some are falling, but more are rising than falling. So when we look at this, we can see that out of the 25 hottest states in daily cases per million, maybe 15 of them are rising and 10 are falling, or something like that. If we focus on the ones that are the hottest, the Gang of Six, let's see how they're doing. Again, Arizona, Arkansas, Alabama, North and South Carolina, and Utah. Now notice I'm leaving some gaps here, and this is because this chart is sorted by hotness in growth, by the growth rates, not in terms of total case adjusted by population. So it's kind of a different way of looking at it, but it's worth noticing that the three states, Rhode Island was just so high that it's going to take it a while to fall off the chart, but at this point Rhode Island is not really a problem. Actually, it might be a problem with that graph, but it's been dropping for a while. It's still at zero. Even now it's not growing, so we're still going to ignore Rhode Island, but it looks like maybe we're going to have to pay attention to them again if they actually turn the corner back towards positive growth. But the Gang of Six here, they're all still in positive territory. None of them are showing a clear sign of recovery, except that Alabama and North Carolina are just barely trending downward in their growth rates. So yes, they're growing at a little under 2% a day. That's a pretty high growth rate, but that number is dropping. So 2% today, maybe 1.9% tomorrow, and so on. We might eventually see a zero growth rate. So that's good. At least these are not showing the really alarming trends that we sometimes see, where a state is growing rapidly and accelerating. The growth rate itself is rising. But these three are showing that. So the real these four, the real problem ones are Utah, South Carolina, Arizona, and Arkansas. And Arizona is still worse than the rest. As I was saying during the country's report, Arizona, I was saying 8%, but it's actually at 9%. Arizona is growing 9% every day in daily cases. That is a shocking number. And it's especially shocking given that Arizona is already a hot spot in the number of cases. Now again, we've seen 1,000 sometimes, so Arizona still has a lot of runway, but it is accelerating towards something. Well, it's going to be one of the worst, no matter. At this point, with this kind of trajectory, when this is all over, we'll look back at Arizona and say it was one of the worst. Whether it gets to be the worst or the first or the second, whether it can match Rhode Island or New York or New Jersey, it's certainly not there yet. But the trajectory of Arizona is pretty bad right now. So we'll keep our eye on Arizona, but there's no sign of it slowing yet. So the gang of 6 then, these are the ones that are the worst in total cases per million. Not horrendous in total cases per million. We've seen worse, but they're pretty bad right now. But then we have the Georgia, Florida, Texas, and I'm surprised California is that far down there. These are the other ones that are growing. Let's just switch to those, Georgia, Florida, and Texas, just to see why are these here in this graph. Because they're not, none of them are hot in cases, not in total cases. We head back here and look at them. I'm going to just throw in California in the mix here as well, because it kind of fits. Nevada? Sure. I'm not going to get too far distracted, but there are other, I'll just briefly show some of these other ones. Some of these. No, these really aren't showing a pattern. But Nevada is. Nevada is rising at 6% and it's accelerating, looking pretty bad, but not a hot spot in terms of actual cases yet. So it's heading for a bad place, but it hasn't gotten there yet. Now, if I zoom out here and look at Georgia, Florida, Texas, and California, well, that's just exactly the opposite of what I wanted to do. Georgia, Florida, Texas, California. I want to show them, not hide them. Well, first of all, notice some of these. Georgia has some wild numbers here. At 500 daily cases per million, that's about as high as we ever see anything. Florida also has some really pretty high numbers, 200, 300. Hot spot days, a lot of warm spot days. So Florida, though its trend line, I'm just going to zoom in on Florida here, though its trend line says that it's not warm, all these days really are pointing to something different. I think that any kindergartner looking at this and drawing the line would draw it up here above 200. So I'm going to say that Florida, in spite of the trend line, is a daily cases hotspot. Its trend line really should probably be pointing upwards into around the 200 range. So Florida is in a pretty bad circumstance, and it also has the unfortunate combination of a relatively high growth rate, 4%. That's very warm and accelerating. So Florida is in some danger. Let's look at Georgia. So Georgia still, according to the trend line, is not warm. It has a few high days, but it's not showing what we saw with Florida, with this real preponderance of high numbers in the 200-300s. Georgia probably is just barely warm, but accelerating quickly, and so it could get there. Texas. Okay, so again, the trend line says it's not warm yet, but the latest data points tell a different story. Texas is probably warm but not hot. This trend line ought to be bending upwards. I think there's a real sense that Texas is heading into a bad place right now in terms of cases, even adjusted by population. And when you're Texas, that's really saying something, because Texas has a lot of population. And finally, California doesn't have the alarming slope upwards of some of these others, but in some sense that's just because it's been growing for a long time. Some of these others started at -2 and they get up to 2, and it looks like that's pretty sharply slanted upwards. California started at 1 and gets up to 2. It doesn't seem like the growth rate is growing very much. If you actually look at the dots here, though, there's not really an obvious sense that California is doing terribly. It's got a lot of dots above 0, certainly. It doesn't have any below 0, so a lot of days above 0. But is there a trend upwards? Very slightly, maybe, but it's not clear. It just seems like a cloud around 2 or 3%. So California growing, maybe slightly accelerating. And in the daily cases per million, California, it's not quite warm. It's still not quite warm. It's cool, obviously rising, and so soon likely to become a warm spot, but still a cool spot in daily cases per million. So California has even more runway than some of these others to put a lid on this thing before it gets into the high hundreds or worse of daily cases per million. Okay, so those are the states. We have the Gang of Six still going strong. A little bit of a sense that North Carolina and was it Arkansas? No, I think it was Alabama. North Carolina and Alabama looking like they might be headed in a better direction. And then Florida and Georgia certainly closing in on them. Maybe Texas, really. Maybe Texas is going to be we'll have a Gang of Nine. And maybe California. But California doesn't have that really high theories. Is Arizona is rising and is accelerating? Is that happening because they're doing great testing and coming up with a bunch of new cases that were always there but they just didn't know about? Or is it rising because there are actually new cases arising? Hospitalizations can give us a partial answer, a hint as to which of those it is. If it's just that we're finding new cases, then if the cases are actually, let's say, stable, then hospitalizations shouldn't rise, because when you get a case, you have a certain chance of getting a bad case, and you would expect that generally hospitalizations will move with the actual number of cases. Even if you never detected the case with a test, you're going to detect it by getting so bad that you go to the hospital. And so it gets detected in a different way. The cases or the trends of cases we would expect would be detected by a trend in hospitalization. So I graphed the hospitalizations, and the question is, especially of the Gang of Six, especially Arizona, are the hospitalizations rising or falling? Now, first of all, as you can see, this graph has some weird characteristics on it, like these numbers from New Jersey that are super high, these lines of dots here. The data here is not great for some states. There are a lot of states that have only reported their testing periodically. I tried to smooth it out by doing a 7-day moving average, but if they've reported for not even 7 days in a row, or if most of the days in the 7-day period aren't reported, we can get something like this. So the trend line is still going to do its best, and some states have pretty good data, but about 10 of the states don't have really anything at all. They have zeros for everything in this particular data set. But fortunately, I think 5 of our 6 Gang of Six states do have data. Pretty good data. So let's look at it. Now, if you look from far away, the trend seems to be that the states that really had bad hospitalizations, these are the first wave states, by the way, Rhode Island, Maryland, Massachusetts, Northeast, the ones that had it worst, Connecticut, are falling. New York, they're sharply falling in hospitalizations. They really have gotten over it. But there are a whole lot of states that are flat. There's just a lot of horizontal lines here. And there are a few other ones like Virginia that also seems to be falling. New Mexico seems to be slowly falling. Mississippi also seems to be falling. But it's really hard to see anything in this mess. So let's just pull out Arizona. Now if we look at Arizona, it does have some weird artifacts because the reporting is odd, but at least for a few weeks here it's had pretty good data. And it's very clear that it's rising. Arizona is rising in hospitalizations. Let's look at another Gang of Six. Let's go. All right, I'm going to have to dig a little bit. There's Arkansas. There's Arkansas also rising. Actually, I'm going to do something a little different here. Rather than picking out the Gang of Six, I'm just going to go quickly through the states and say rising or falling. Maryland is falling. New Jersey, actually, pause here. The trend line says rising, but obviously it's because we had old data here. Trend line doesn't know what to do with it. No data. It's obviously falling in recent weeks. So New Jersey is falling. Still pretty high, but falling. South Dakota rising a little bit. Let's leave that one on the graph. Nebraska seems sort of flat. Colorado, really hard to say with data all over the place, but pretty probably falling. Latest days are low. Older days are higher, even older days are even higher. Colorado's falling. Rhode Island, very strongly falling. This is what it looks like when you've got pretty good data and a state that's gotten over it. A little bit of a sense that Rhode Island might be seeing a second wave in a single state, which is something I keep saying doesn't happen. That once a state has had it, it doesn't get it again. Maybe Rhode Island will prove me wrong. We'll keep an eye on it. Mississippi, falling. Connecticut really falling, though the data is not great there. Arizona rising. New Mexico falling. Probably South Carolina, really hard to say, but you could say with this line of dots that it's rising, but we'll just remember South Carolina and just say the trend line said it was falling. Indiana probably falling, a little hard to say. Georgia definitely falling. Arkansas, good data and rising. Massachusetts, strong, good data and strongly falling. Florida, if you look right in there, the latest trend in Florida suggests that it's rising, but I'm going to take it out because the trend line as a whole is falling. Utah is rising. Virginia is falling. Alabama, Minnesota is falling. Alabama maybe slightly rising. Oklahoma might just show a mini trend rising. We can remember that because Oklahoma, I think, is going to be one of our next gang of 10 or whatever we end up with. New Hampshire falling, Ohio falling, Wisconsin falling. Tennessee's flat, maybe slightly rising. I'm not going to say much there. North Dakota, by the way, has a spike. This is a pending gang member. Washington, hard to say. The data's weird. Kansas, kind of flat, not too bad. Oregon, if it's rising from a low place. Kentucky may be rising. Again, there's this sense we keep seeing in states that some of them are getting worse just in the past week in hospitalizations. Maybe we'll look at that a little later. Wyoming, also this tiny spike, but overall not. Maine is fine. Montana, maybe a little bit of an upward trend, but very few cases, very low hospitalizations. Idaho, maybe a little bit of upward trends, but by now we're getting into this is sorted by hospitalization, so we're getting into the states that just don't have that many hospitalizations per million. So of the states then that actually have pretty good data, clear upward rising trend, and have a lot of hospitalizations now, we can see we've kind of selected the gang of 6. Not quite. South Dakota is sort of a wannabe here. It's way worse than everyone. I don't know why, but South Dakota, the hospitalizations are roughly flat, but they're at a high level. So I don't know what's going on with South Dakota, but we certainly get the 3 A's, Arizona, Arkansas, and Alabama, and we get Utah. Recall that North Carolina, South Carolina the data is so weird that it's hard to say, but it does have these points up here, and they were down here before, so we could look at that data, just the blue points there. It's kind of muddy, but I've looked at this before, and I don't want to get rid of everything else. I'd say South Carolina is arguably rising from this data. North Carolina, we don't have data for. If we go to North Carolina, it's all zeros. We can't say. But this, to me, is evidence, moderate evidence, to say that the gang of 6 is not rising because of increased testing. That's not the only reason. They may be rising because of increased testing to some degree, but if that were the only reason, we wouldn't see hospitalizations rise. The fact that hospitalizations rise strongly, at least, or moderately suggests that the underlying caseload, the underlying infections are rising. So it's not just the testing. Some of these 4 states and others do seem to have a growing problem with actual COVID-19 cases. It's not just that we're doing so well with testing that we're catching ones we didn't know about. There are new ones. This is what I see when I look at this graph. And also, as we scanned through all the top states, we saw 5 or 10 times a little bit of an uptick in the last week. And so that's also a little concerning, especially because these are 7-day moving averages. So when we see, I forget who exactly had that. Let's look at Texas, for instance. No, Texas is another day we don't have data for. Let's look at, and I think we also don't have data for California, unfortunately, in this data set. Yep, no data for California. Too bad. But there's a trend, a geographic trend here for sure. If you look at these, they're not northeast states. They're not usually western states. They're middle of the country states. So the virus hit the coasts hardest and first, especially the East Coast, especially the Northeast. And they got over it, and we haven't seen a lot of sign they're going to get it again. We'll see. But now we're seeing it in the middle of the country. And so you pick let's look at Ohio, for instance. Yeah, so Ohio, interestingly, hasn't really gotten it. Maybe it got it when Michigan did, and Michigan certainly has gotten a lot better. But you look at Kansas. Kansas has a slightly upward trend in the last week. You look at Oklahoma. Oklahoma has a strong upward trend in just the last 4 days, enough to say that's probably real. Oklahoma is coming on with new hospitalizations, and presumably that means it's getting more and more new infections. All right, I don't want to spend much more time on this. I said I'd spend a lot of time in the States, and I am, but I do want to at least take another brief look before and by the way, my county date is a day out of date. It's only up to the 21st, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the counties because it'll look a lot like last time. So today is really going to have a focus on the states. So if you look at this very busy report, you see a lot of a trend upwards. Population tested daily by state. No, this isn't the report I wanted. Sorry, I want the positive tests per state. Ignoring some of the things that are probably just wrong because they're so far above everyone else. What is the trend in this graph? What percent is testing positive? Now, keep in mind that if we keep our testing rate steady, if we're testing a certain percentage per day, and always keep testing that same percentage of population per day, then this should exactly map to the number of new cases, because it'll rise if there are actual new cases. It will tend to fall if there are not actual new cases. There can be complexities around that, but roughly speaking, if this rises, it's either because we're testing more people, it's much like the one we were just looking at, or because there are actually new infections. And my thesis here is that, as in the other case, we're going to tend to see this rise when there are actually new cases, when we actually have new growing epicenters of infection. It could be that we're just testing more people, but we reach a point where we've kind of found everyone that we knew that already had it, because the testing is, as I've said many times, the United States is doing testing very well compared to what other countries were doing at their stage and at this stage. South Korea was doing 0.8% of the population. We're doing 3, 4, 5, 10. We're doing very well, and so we're probably catching a lot of cases. So if we are seeing a positive test rate grow, I hypothesize that's because we are actually seeing the underlying infection rate grow. More and more people are actually getting the virus. So the question then is, which of these are trending upward? Mostly, they've been trending downward. We saw until just a couple weeks ago, everyone was trending downward. New York's a pretty good example of this, I think. Let's see. They were, but still, this is the growth. This is the positive test rate graph of a state that's recovering. New York, they're down to less than 1% every day, and they had a lot more once upon a time. New York is doing well. Rhode Island, also doing very well. They're trending downward. They're seeing fewer and fewer positive tests. There's just the faintest hint they may be heading upward that we saw in some other graphs. So who isn't doing well? Well, New Mexico's doing okay. I'm just going to go through the list again. New Jersey's doing great. Louisiana at least isn't rising. Maybe they're seeing a problem, but Louisiana was an earlier wave, probably has a handle on it, probably won't see it grow. North Dakota is okay. Alaska is seeing a slight rise. Massachusetts doing okay. Just keep looking for the ones that are going up. And the good news here is that a lot of states are seeing fewer and fewer positive tests. Everyone we just scanned through was pretty good. But here's one that isn't quite. Tennessee is starting to turn upward. Utah, sharply upward from 5% positive test rate. Recent day is 15%. At least doubled, maybe tripled the positive test rate in Utah. That is not a good curve. Vermont's good. Michigan's good. Minnesota's fine. South Dakota's looking pretty good, though here again we see a little bit of a sense that it may be getting somewhere, but the trend line doesn't see it yet. We'll move on. Wisconsin, A whole lot of states are doing well. California is doing okay, but as has been the case for a while, California always feels like it's just barely holding on by the skin of its teeth. It's got this 5% rate. It has certainly not dropped it to 1% like New York, but at least it's not zooming off to infinity. So California is in balance. Not bad, not good. Nevada, slightly upward. I guess I'll leave that one there. West Virginia is okay. Iowa is good. Arkansas, not so good. Nebraska, good. New Hampshire, Maryland. Where are the bad ones? Florida, not so good. Kentucky maybe was okay. Yeah, there's something weird that happens with Oklahoma. I'm not going to zoom out, but Oklahoma has a whole lot of 100%, as though everyone they tested for a day was always positive. Clearly the data is incorrect, and so the trend line is way above the graph. But if you blink this, we can see Oklahoma's dots were around 2 or 3% a few weeks ago. Now it's seeing dots like 7%, 10%. I think if we had a proper trend line here, it would definitely be upwards. North Carolina is kind of flat, not too bad. Alabama is upwards. Georgia trending upwards. Montana's upwards, but it's so low we don't need to worry about it right now. Washington's fine. Virginia's good. Indiana, South Carolina, wow, look at that. That's really going upwards. Maine is great. Arizona is the worst of all. We'll return to that probably. Wyoming is flat, maybe slightly upwards, but low total percentage. Texas not looking so good. Kansas, Pennsylvania, Missouri. I could include Missouri in there, sure. Colorado's looking good. Oregon, Hawaii. I'm actually just taking a lot of time going through all the states here. We're not going to do this every day, but just to say, all right, and then the probably not so much data on the territories. So that's a lot of states we now have, which are showing a bad trend on this graph. They're showing their positive test rate grow. I believe, from what I'm seeing here, that this represents an actual uptick in infections in every one of those states, and that Arizona, as always, is the poster child for epidemic. Arizona, which had its trend line down at 10%, never that great actually, it was worse earlier, has turned back around and is now at 20% positive test rate. Almost twice as, well, half again as bad, or twice as bad as most of the other ones. And then all these other ones, we can see these are, again, these are middle America here. Tennessee, Utah, Nevada, Arkansas, these are the center of the country. Florida is an honorary member of the center of the country. Oklahoma, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Arizona, Texas, Missouri. So what we see here are the gang of six for sure. Arizona, Alabama, Arkansas, plus we have North and South Carolina, I think. North Carolina, as we've seen, is kind of falling out of the gang of six, and it doesn't quite show here. Briefly looking at it, it's pretty flat, slightly tilted up. You could include it in here. And then Utah, how's Utah doing? Utah, I think, no, Utah is in here. Yeah, Utah's pretty bad. So these are our states. How many of them is that? Tennessee, Utah, Nevada, Arkansas, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 states, and some of these are just barely there. Nevada and Missouri we could have thrown out. We could even have thrown out Tennessee, Arkansas, and Florida. And that really does get us more towards the gang of six, with Arkansas maybe falling away. So these are the states that have it worst, I think. This graph is actually confirming what we saw in the hospitalization graph and what we've seen in our other graphs, just the sense that there are 6 or 5 states, maybe 10 at most, that have it pretty bad, and some that have it really bad. And Arizona that has it worst of all. So over and over, different metrics, we're seeing this trend. And California isn't really there. California does not have it that bad. Let's look at California again. In testing rates, California has flattened out at about 5%. It's certainly it's the best of the worst, we might say. The best of these 12. California is as good as the very best in terms of testing rates. It's not seeing its testing rates rise. They are holding steady at 5. So there again, we see California in the balance. Didn't we see that with this other graph as well, with the hospitalizations? No, California didn't have hospitalization data, neither did Texas. But this data is another way of looking at it, a completely different way of looking at it, but it still points back to this same place, which is we have certain states, they tend to be in the middle of the country, and they are the new wave. Northeast recovered, Michigan, Louisiana, Illinois recovered. California is hanging in balance in its own little world, and then here's the middle of the country coming online fairly quickly, fairly hard. The news is not good for these 12 states, and especially for those 6. And again, from this calculation, the 6 is not AAA, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah. It is Arizona, Alabama, Georgia, not normally in the gang of 6, Utah, usually in the gang of 6, Texas, and South Carolina. So Utah and Texas, or Georgia and Texas, are showing up looking pretty bad here, according to testing percentage. All right, I'm pretty much out of time. I'll just hop very quickly to the counties of California. At least I think it will. Maybe my graphs aren't going to show me. Oh yeah, these are the counties. They're loading. Let me just go to the graphs that matter most, I think. Daily cases per million, Imperial and Kings still leading. I think those are getting a little better, especially Imperial. We don't have many hot counties. We only have 2 hot counties, Imperial and Kings, in daily cases per million. And we only have a couple warm ones, Riverside and Los Angeles, a few that are close. The rest of the counties are cool. They're not actually in that bad shape in daily cases per million, but you can see many of them are trending upwards, and so they might get there. In terms of the growth, this is much what we've been seeing, which is all the counties of California, all the warmest ones are growing. They're all above 0, with the single exception of Imperial, which was kind of the first wave of California. It seems to be getting over it quickly, but all the other counties are growing in California. The worst is Madera, randomly, Stanislaus, some of the littler ones, Yolo, Merced, Santa Barbara, San Benito. It takes a while before we get down into the bigger counties, so that at least that means there are no big counties that are growing really quickly. The ones that are growing quickly are small counties, and maybe that's just a blip and they'll get over it, or maybe not, but even if they don't, they're not going to contribute a lot of cases because they don't have a lot of people. Los Angeles is looking so-so, by far the biggest contributor of cases, growing at a little over 1% and stable. So California broadly is holding steady because Los Angeles broadly is holding steady. A couple of bad days, some recent good days, holding steady. And if we look at all the counties, we do have just a ton of counties growing right now, and a lot of them accelerating, but Los Angeles, not being one of them, is keeping the numbers for California overall from looking too bad. Now, if Los Angeles does recover and these counties keep growing, then we might very well see an Arizona here, where at least our counties already look like Arizona, some of them, and maybe the whole state will. But right now, Los Angeles, by not growing quickly and by showing some sense that it's maybe getting a handle on things, is keeping the total numbers looking good, fairly good, not too bad. But on the whole, all the counties of California, with a few small exceptions, and big exceptions like San Mateo, San Francisco actually, those were the Bay Area. I think I did an analysis of in my blog yesterday. The Bay Area is looking mixed. So there are some big counties that they're not showing up in the reports above because they're not hot. They're not even warm. But some of the big counties are doing okay, and that also helps. Well, it doesn't help with the total numbers because they're not warm. But it helps if those who live in San Mateo can be happy to know that San Mateo is shrinking. It's 3% a day. And similarly with some of the other San Francisco and some of the other Bay Area counties, San Francisco Bay Area counties. So the news for California at first glance looks bad, but if you look a little closer, some of the biggest counties are doing okay, and so maybe the news for California is mixed. There are just a lot of counties that are growing quickly right now. Population, the testing is being done very well, and San Francisco and Imperial really leading the pack with 12%. As always, San Francisco or California is doing well with its testing. So that's the news. San Francisco fighting to not look terrible and more or less succeeding compared to the many states that are looking terrible right now. The states that are looking terrible are Middle America and Florida and Texas. Maybe Texas is Middle America, I don't know, but the coasts are doing better. The middle of the United States, not so much. But at the country level, the countries are doing generally pretty well. The world as a whole still slightly growing, but a lot of countries seem to be getting better. The ones that aren't tend to be small. And so the picture for the world is pretty good. The picture for the states, not so good. And the picture for California, well, it just kind of depends how you look at it. California is mixed. That's the news for today. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for listening and watching.